So our next speaker, I brought the bios this time, so next speaker tonight is Ryan Indigo Warman. He's a co-organizer of this event and a founding member of the ERIE student group. Indigo is a doctoral candidate in the East-West Psychology Department of the California Institute of Integral Studies, where his research focuses on utopian visions and sustainable communities as pathways to a world that works for everyone. And he has been a cannabis activist for over 15 years and an industry professional since 2010. He currently works for a medical cannabis distribution company. So without further ado, Ryan Indigo Warman.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay. Good? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Dr. Detroit and Amanda, also for being here tonight. I'd like to honor Mike before I start, because he and I have been trying to get something like this together for maybe a couple of years now, and it all finally clicked. I'm very grateful to Amanda for being here as well. I've got a lot of respect for the Drug Policy Alliance. And also, just to add my own little riff to Mike's opening, give a shout out to the former Patients Resource Center at 350 Divisadero, which is down the street and used to be to the left. It's no longer there. That was the first dispensary collective that I was a member of. You remember that one too? I thought I was really cool as a senior in high school with my medical cannabis card coming up to San Francisco to buy pot. But I really quickly got schooled by all the patients there and really had my eyes open, talking to them about their experiences and falling out of a 3-story window and breaking every bone in your body and using cannabis to just live. So that really kind of galvanized me at a tender young age of 18. And I also had the opportunity to see Terrence Hallinan, our former district attorney, who was directly responsible for allowing the dispensaries to propagate in the city by refusing to prosecute them. He stood up in this smoke-filled room down the street and gave that same adage from Dennis Perone that all use is medical use, whether that medicine is for the mind, body, or soul, or spirit. So with those dedications, I'm going to take us a little bit further out there, waxed a little metaphysical, and then I know Amanda's going to bring it on home for us. The inspiration for my part of the talk came from an article that I found on a website called timewheel.net, and it's now moved to cultureofawareness.org. And the headline is How Legalizing Cannabis May Ignite a New Spiritual Revolution. And this is just a couple little excerpts. The effects of marijuana, as many of us know, are very insightful in nature. It talks about closed-eye visuals and increased imaginative capacities and a deeper appreciation for art and music, as well as a sense of unity with nature. For the novice cannabis user, these effects sometimes shock and astound, and open one up to what Joanna Macy calls the ecological self, an idea of a self or connection to something that's bigger than the individual you. And the fact that we're seeing festivals appearing around the world to celebrate this herb is really just creating more community and space around that awakening. And the author, and I would agree, thinks that so many people are attending these festivals because of that spiritual potential that's within cannabis. So this is where I feel like they really sum it up. A spiritually intellectual culture is quietly forming with a shared interest in the collective evolution of the human species. And these few initiates have a focus on cultivating a culture based on art appreciation, truth-seeking, and spiritual development. As cannabis is legalized in more places, its prevalence in local cultures will be a shockwave that reinstalls an appreciation for art and nature into citizens of legalized areas. Pretty radical, right? Sounds pretty cool. I think we've been spoiled here in San Francisco because we've been experiencing that for a long time. But a slight little detour here, and you'll see where I'm going in a second. I wanted to give a little aside on the gateway theory. Most of us know that that theory's been pretty well debunked, and if you'd like me to explain that further, I can do that. But, so these two kind of parallel examples I wanted to share. One is of a dear college friend, UC Santa Cruz, whose personal journey was sort of defined by him experiencing cannabis and then finding his way to mushrooms, and from those spiritual awakenings with psilocybin, finding his way to Buddhism as his spiritual path. And that the first story I ever heard him tell in an English class, and we're instant friends. The other one is a vignette that was circulated at least 10 or 15 years ago. Amanda, I was going to ask you if you might remember where it was from, but it's not important. It was, I think, by the Drug Policy Foundation. And it basically goes something along the lines of, just say no, drug education in the schools basically tells you that all drugs are bad, and that all drugs are equally bad for the same reason. So, someone might try cannabis and say, hey, this ain't so bad. In fact, I actually kind of like this. Well, if they lied to me about cannabis, maybe heroin's not so bad either. And the example was of a daughter, I believe, of like a state congresswoman or something of that nature, who tried cannabis and then wound up in rehab for heroin in the span of a couple of weeks, all because of bad drug education, misinformation that lumps all drugs together and says that they're bad. So those two things that kind of are, they're two parallels, right? One's a positive outcome, one's a negative outcome, we could say. And we need that education because that's the only gateway theory there is. It's from this misinformation that lumps all substances together. My assertion is that given the proper set and setting, cannabis can be a gateway drug to higher consciousness. And I think that's all something we can agree is beneficial. We're talking meditative states, freer thinking, many of the things that Mike touched on that I know Amanda's going to touch on as well. And you know, Dr. Timothy Leary advocated daily meditations with cannabis and weekly journeys with psilocybin. I'm not saying that path is for everyone, but that's what he advocated. Seems like a reasonable plan to me. His other big mantra was question authority, and I've always believed that that may be one of the more covert reasons why cannabis was made illegal in the first place, is that stimulation of alpha brain states, free thinking, creative thinking, against the grain, out of the box thinking, things that go against the establishment. So here's another example. Anybody in the room seen the movie Pineapple Express? That very first scene where the soldier's given some cannabis and they're asking him these questions about how do you feel about your commanding officer and whatnot, and he starts giggling and laughing uncontrollably. It's a very comical example of how cannabis itself and the act of using it is a challenge to the establishment in and of itself. It's always been an act of civil disobedience for me. There's another very funny YouTube video that you may have seen, filmed in Colorado shortly after legalization passed, where three grandmothers are given a bong to pass around, and then they sit there and play Cards Against Humanity and just have a wonderful, elated, happy, fun time. And it's that subtle psychological shift that happens once it's legal now, even though it's not 100% legal yet. But there's still a shift that happens. And that subtle psychological shift combined with the spiritual awakening potential of cannabis really has the potential to help us transform our whole society and whole civilization. They've got a couple other videos in that series too, a bunch of retired cops smoking pot for the first time ever. It's pretty funny. And the last little vignette that I have is one of my favorite experiences from being a bud tender, and a middle-aged man comes up to my counter, about this big, and says, "I haven't smoked pot since 1972. And just kind of looks at me with this expectant look of trust and a little bit of fear and trepidation. And my response was, let's look at the lower 2 shelves of our cannabis flowers and let me introduce you to your new best friend, CBD. So it's those little things that, you know, were therapeutic for me while I was working at a cannabis dispensary for a year and a half after my mother passed away from cancer. It was part of my healing process, giving that gift back to the community and helping other people who might be going through something similar. But really the spiritual opening of cannabis is what has made me love it and made me want to be a champion for it, along with all those other things. And I'm basically proceeding from the belief that a spiritual revolution is already underway. It's been happening since the 60s, and cannabis has been a huge part of it since the very beginning. Normalizing cannabis can't help but encourage this trend as it becomes more mainstream. There's another funny little video. I'm going to send links out to all of these, to the ERIE list, why legalizing cannabis is the New World Order's worst nightmare. It's basically just a couple of Joe Rogan podcasts kind of strung together, but he's talking about these spiritual awakening potentials coming from these sacred plant teachers. So you combine that spiritual potential with the sustainability potential of hemp, and that old hippie bumper sticker, food, fuel, and fiber, hemp can save the planet. And we really begin to see the ways that cannabis is an ally for us in these trying times and in this very daunting task of essentially having to transform our whole way of living so that we can survive as a species. Cannabis can help us transform both the physical world and the inner metaphysical realms, and the establishment has known that it's a threat for a long time. I threw in this little vignette about Henry Ford and his hemp car. I found another little video that I'll throw in. But we need to keep the pressure on and keep pushing for reforms, keep organizing locally, not go into despair, like Mike said. And we've won a battle with the legalization of cannabis in California, but we've got a very daunting, larger situation. So let's stay together and be kind to each other and use this plant ally in all the ways that we can.